commercial here. It's Fantasy Star here. Check this out. Nice. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of Sega. Will you talk about the history of Sega and the games industry? I'll give it my all. Sega, I know, was a company that had international origins. They began making primitive arcade games for the U.S. military after World War II. And they basically made their name in Japan as an arcade manufacturer. With the success of the Famicom and the rise of home console gaming, it was a natural progression for them to want to get in on that. Nintendo beat them to the punch in Japan with the Famicom, so Sega was always playing catch up. And to my understanding, Nintendo was able to have good relationships with manga magazines that appealed to the demographic that would be buying Sega's games. And then Nintendo also, they had just these, cultural phenomenon games like, Super Mario Brothers, and really became a humongous part of Japanese pop culture and American pop culture. And Sega was always, in the runner-up position, and a distant runner-up position. They were kind of like WCW to the WWF in the 1980s or early 90s. They had their fans, had their following, but they were not in the driver's seat. And, in the United States, the Sega Genesis, which was a tremendous piece of hardware, that could really put out arcade quality video games, even though they weren't quite identical, they weren't quite arcade perfect, but they could pass for arcade games in the home of the 16-bit variety. That was out in the United States when the Nintendo was still out. American gamers were not as into role-playing games as Japanese gamers. So like the Famicom, it had like Dragon Quest and all these RPGs on it, that were all just kind of built to be played in the home. While, American gamers were more into having the arcade experience in the home, and that was perfectly what the Sega Genesis, Sega Mega Drive lent itself to. And then on top of that, Sega had some really cool advertising in America that, kind of cast the Sega Genesis as like, hey, this is cool. It blows the Nintendo out of the way in terms of its graphics. And yes, so you should buy the Sega Genesis. It's like it's a much beefier, edgier, cooler console. Not that the Nintendo wasn't cool. I mean, I never had a friend anywhere ever that's like, oh, you're a nerd for owning a Nintendo. I mean, everyone liked both things, but there definitely were kind of tribal alliances and people who preferred one over the other. But I definitely fell into the Sega camp because when I was in the third grade in 1993, my mom went back to college and I babysat myself all summer. She was taking day classes, so I was by myself during the day. And because I was so responsible, she said, I'll buy you a video game console. What do you want? And I went with the Sega Genesis because that, had lots of really cool commercials. And I was a huge fan of X-Men. And Sega advertised X-Men on the Sega Genesis, and I just thought I remember it had like "Welcome to the Next Level" written in like Wolverine claw marks. So that's the reason I bought the Sega Genesis. In Japan, the Mega Drive, it still had freaking awesome games. It seemed early on, it didn't have very many games out. I think they had a few arcade ports. So they had a pretty underwhelming amount of software to back up their hardware that had generated some buzz. And, Sega never was really able to catch up, even though they released some phenomenal software, the best software, I think, of the 16-bit era, especially with the Sonic the Hedgehog games. And, the Sega Genesis always played more smooth. Oh, yeah, I'm a big Sega guy. I like Nintendo, too, but I'm a huge Sega guy. I mean, I've got Sonic plushies, like, all over the game room. So, yeah, I'm a big Sonic guy. There's Mario in the background, but, I feel like there's Super Sonic up there, and I've got, like, a Sonic 2 poster and a Game Gear poster there. And, if you look over the window there, I've got some Sonic plushies hanging there, too. So, yeah, I'm a big Sega enthusiast, and Sonic the Hedgehog is my favorite video game character. I'm a much bigger fan of the Japan portrayal of Sonic. Actually, hang on a second here. I have a cool Sonic box right here, so I just like to have this hanging around the game room. And I will have like Sonic hanging up next to Mystic Gohan up there. I definitely, Sega, it had its followers in Japan, but they just, they weren't able to overtake Nintendo or the PC Engine. You love your kid's room. I wish it was. Well, actually, this is my room that Santino, partakes in with me. We share it together. So, and actually, when I was a bachelor, my whole house, every room was like this. Once my wife moved in, it had to be concentrated into one room. So, you got to be nice. So. Anywho, so yeah, it wasn't really, so it was kind of like, my understanding is that, Sega of Japan, they knew they had a winner with Sega Genesis, but they knew it wasn't going to overtake Nintendo in Japan. So, they were making their own, sequel console, the Sega Saturn, and, there was, in my understanding, an increasing kind of rivalry and drift, Sonic drift between the American and Japanese development teams of Sega of America and Sega of Japan. And a lot of that drift, in my opinion, was due to the fact that the American Sega team did not understand Japanese culture. And the worst thing was, as a result of them not understanding Japanese culture, is they, I think, we're very disrespectful to the Sonic team, because, okay, so they're coming up with, we got to make a Mario killer, okay? And so that is Sonic, okay? So they come up with Sonic, and they know that the American market is the big market that they have to overtake Nintendo in. So it's like, okay, Nintendo beat us in Japan, but the American market is just as important, if not more important. So we got to make sure we get Nintendo in the American market. So they're like, okay, let's make a mascot that appeals to Americans. So they make Sonic. And then, so it's kind of like Sonic is this love letter to America through the Japanese prism. And, keep in mind, dude, Japan has always kind of had this tendency to look at other cultures and kind of learn from those cultures and try to, Japanify or kind of filter the merits of other cultures into their own cultural prism, through the Japanese prism, kind of make it Japanese and utilize it in their own way. So the reflection of American culture through the Japanese mirror is, I think, a particularly beautiful and interesting one. And you got to keep in mind too, America and Japan fought a war, dude. They got nuked. I mean, it's okay. So it's like, Japan is very much, I think, looking to America as an example, but they also, I think, don't want to be disrespected by the Americans. So Sonic Team, Sega spends all this time on this beautiful Sonic the Hedgehog lore. He's Chuck Yeager's rival's reincarnation. They're looking at movies like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. They give him a girlfriend like Jessica Rabbit. He's got an American style rock band. He's got he's a cool anime version of Felix the Cat. And then you just get these hack, loudmouth American toy makers that just don't fucking get it. And they're like, ooh, oh, well, this is like, literally, it's like Madeline Schroeder just like patting herself on the back for like, oh, I got rid of Sonic's fangs and his girlfriend and da 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 da. And it's like, it's like eventually like Sega and America, Sega of Japan and Sega of America, they either like worked it out or one side capitulated or whatever, and it ended up working out because the quality of the Sonic games on the Sega Genesis was unparalleled. I mean, I think it was better than any Mario game in 2D, and I like the Mario games, but it was that tension, I think, that led to, a hostility towards Sega of Japan, towards Sega of America, and it led to some really stupid decisions, like, Sega rejecting Sony as a partner when Tom Kalinske was, brokering a deal with Sony. So Sega basically passed up on the PlayStation. The Sega Saturn. I mean, I get why Sega was like, "Hey, listen, we put all this work into the Sega Saturn. We've learned all these lessons from the Americans on how to overtake Nintendo with the Sega Saturn. We've got the Sega Saturn ready to go. We don't want to, throw away all our work just because the Americans tell us to." It's like, okay, I get it, but you can incorporate Sony into the work of the Sega Saturn. You could have a Saturn PlayStation hybrid, something along those lines. But there was just, I don't know. I don't know. And I know that there was at one time Sega and Sony had worked together on a floppy disk console for the Sega Mega Drive, and that didn't come to fruition. So I don't know if there was bad blood with the Japanese sides, but I do believe that Kalinske and Kutaragi had pretty much agreed that, once Nintendo screwed over Sony wanted to work with Sega. And, I guess Hayao Nakayama basically shot it down. And then, he ended up making his own enemy. But Sega Saturn, I mean, it was the number one console in Japan for a while until Final Fantasy VII came out. And it outsold the N64 in Japan. The problem is that it just didn't do well in other markets around the world because in, Japan, they had really cool commercials and phenomenal arcade ports that in this case sometimes were arcade perfect. So awesome commercials, perfect arcade ports, and also Sega had garnered the reputation of being the cool console in the West, which I think probably appealed to Japanese consumers because, Sega's like, oh, it's cool, it's exotic, it's cool in America. It's like taking the cool Sega arcade experience home. Sega was able to have the cool console, like with the Sega Genesis made in the United States with the Sega Saturn in Japan. It's just that, the actual advertising of the Sega Saturn in America was horrendous. And Tom Kalinske, was gone. Bernie Stolar didn't want to bring any of the cool RPGs over. And the Sega Saturn ended up being flat-footed to a lot of American consumers. And I was one who bought the Sega Saturn. That was my console in 1996, 97. That's what I bought. That was my next-gen console after the Genesis. And I just remember the Saturn getting discontinued in America. And I was like, this sucks, man, because I ended up getting a PlayStation. And I was happy with my PlayStation, but I love the Sega Saturn. I mean, I bought that as soon as I had the opportunity to. So I was a big Sega supporter. I loved X-Men Children of the Atom. And then, the Dreamcast came out, and it did well. It had its fans, but it couldn't compete with the PlayStation 2 because the PlayStation was a global phenomenon, and the technology of the PS2 was overhyped, and the marketplace just got too crowded. With Nintendo, who always had their following, and Microsoft was new and exciting, and Sega just got kind of crowded out of the console scene. And I know that there were forces within Sega of America and Sega of Japan that wanted to keep with hardware, and then there were other forces that wanted to shift over to software because it was more financially viable, and those are the people that won. And it's sad because once Sega stopped producing hardware, the quality of their games declined rapidly. And, there were definitely some really good games. The good Sega games that were out on things like the Xbox and the PS2, those really good ones were the ones that were developed for the Dreamcast. And then because it was like if you have your hardware out and you're putting out titles, you have to have good. You have to kind of defend the honor of your hardware. But once it becomes like a strictly software brand, that's when I think the quality of Sega's games became sporadic. I mean, you can still find phenomenal Sega games, but definitely, I mean, the like games like Altered Beast on the PS2, or Sonic has had like a very choppy, I guess you could say, transition to 3D with some okay games, some bad games, some good games, but they're inconsistent, But that doesn't mean that Sonic as a character is still awesome. And I think that some Sonic, like Sonic Forces, I think that's a very underrated game. I like everything I played out of Sonic Forces. And yeah, so I don't know. So that's kind of my take on, running up the history of Sega. So Diego kind of asked me like, hey, what's your understanding of the history of Sega? And that's pretty much it, So it is what it is. So, I mean, and I've tried to kind of add my spin on, what other people have said. I've been hearing the Steam Deck has good reviews. Interesting. Liv lost the title to Rousey. Good, because Ronda Rousey's freaking awesome. They should put the actual heavyweight title on Ronda Rousey. And hello, Nick Darling, my good friend. All right. Yeah. Oh, dude, I love this commercial right here. Sonic Art is a good game. I mean, we're just gonna watch the Sega to Sanshiro commercials. This is what we're doing. I mean, they could have legitimately just ran the Sega to Sanshiro commercials in America. I mean, they actually ran the Japanese Chrono Trigger commercial in America. They put stupid subtitles on it, but, I mean, this was absurd and entertaining enough to run, so. Plus, this is cool as, like, the, it's, obviously, it's a very cool, it's a cool logo, cool slogan. Solo Crisis. Sega Saturn. I love Japanese commercials. They're better than American ones. That is true. Azel.
Hi, I'm Yuri Getter. Now, I'll send a telepathic message to you.
I have not seen this commercial. I don't know what that game is, but I telepathically now want to buy it. Winter heat! I want to get the Japanese version of World Series Baseball, which is called Hideo Nomo Baseball. Burning Rangers. The House of the Dead. I mean, like, okay. It took Sega about a year and a half to come up with the mastery that is... Okay, it took like, what, 2 years to come up with Sega Sanshiro. But you gotta keep in mind, dude, like, these are like the greatest video game commercials ever made. And like, the American Sega Saturn commercials were like this weird screaming blue head. I mean, it was just weird and like unrelated. I mean, oh, this is a great one. Sakura Wars. I haven't seen this one. Who's that PBS guy that Kenny Lauderdale always plays? It's all like really happy that they've got Sakura Wars on his station. This is a good one. Yeah, these are games that were left in Japan. Meanwhile, like, you know, Final Fantasy VII is like selling like gangbusters. And like, you know, Bernie Stolar is like, oh, we don't want RPGs, those are for nerds. That is how you judo throw a goal, my friends. Nice play. Oh no. These are Kid Shoryuken, man. He got an awesome selection of commercials here. Oh, Deep Fear, this is a good one. How is Deep Fear? Was Deep Fear? I don't think Deep Fear was ever released in the United States. Lunar 2. Yeah, there's another one we leave. Let's leave Deep Fear and Lunar 2 in Japan. Dude, and it's not like Sega Genesis, man, you know. They well, this is a great one. I feel like I have to buy that game now. What I was saying is that Sega Genesis brought out all the Japanese games. You know, they brought out Phantasy Star 2, Slayers. I want to say I have the Slayers RPG on Super Famicom. Oh, here we go. That game is so good. Oh, look, it's a game named after me. Oh man, this is the sad end right here. Makes you want to open your wallet and buy these games. Yes, it does. I mean, Sega Sanshiro has been confirmed to have survived this. He's appeared at multiple Sega things, you know, and ramen commercials in Japan, so he definitely survived that blast. There's Mr. Dreamcast, so you know. Now we shift gears, but yeah, man. Dude, like nothing beats the Sega Saturn, man. It's I mean, watching those commercials, you now understand why Sega Saturn did so well in Japan. And then, like, you know, when you watch the commercials for Sega Saturn in the United States, it's not that they're, like, horrible. They're not. But it's just, like, they're just not at that level. And meanwhile, you know, Sony is, you know, doing all their Sega Genesis-style commercials and stuff like that. And Sega's going for this weird, you know, remember like Mr. Plow's second commercial on The Simpsons where that guy in a toga throws a snow globe down and like it blows away and it says Mr. Plow? Like, that's exactly what American Sega Saturn commercials were like.